Hello to all you PE students. We're going to get into what is often cited as a really big topic in PE. We're going to look at the different types of muscle fibers, And I kind of want to dispel a myth really to begin with. The first thing I want to do is to draw in a very scratchy continuum. I'm going to do that again because it was ridiculously unstraight. Look how much I did it better this time. And I just want to kind of put the two extreme ends on this continuum. Just kind of, make relevance to a concept here. When we talk about muscle fiber types, we're going to describe here three individual types of muscle fibers. But in reality, muscle fibers exist along a continuum. At one end of the continuum, we have muscle fibers who are really specialized for endurance. So at this end over here, we have these specialized endurance fibers, and then at the extreme other end, we have sort of specifically adapted fibers for power, for strength, for speed. Now, in the theory that we're going to talk about, we're basically going to say, look, you know, every kind of possible muscle fiber in between those 2 points can exist, but we're basically going to take a snapshot of that point there, of that point there, and of that point there, and we're going to give those points a name. We're going to give those points a name. So, not very subtly, we can call them type 1. Type 1. We can call the one in the middle type 2, but in this case we say type 2A, and the one up at the extreme power end, we call that type 2B. So just have that clear in your mind that we're not talking about there are only three individual muscle type structures. No, we don't work in that way. Our muscles exist along a continuum. The other thing we can say here, of course, is that a muscle which exists or muscle which performs down at this endurance end, they're muscles that are useful in certain performances like marathon, like triathlon, such as road cycling, for example. This is the kind of fiber that the men and women competing in these sorts of events are going to look to maximize and increase the performance of. Whereas, up at this end, we're talking about people who are throwing javelins or are 100-meter sprinters and that kind of thing, right? This is power performance up at this end. And maybe what we've got in the middle, a combination of all of them, is we've got kind of games players, right? Games players. And that's kind of one of the ways I would encourage you to think about it. Games players sort of need all three, but perhaps specialize in these type 2A fibers. The real power athletes, short bursts of power up around those type 2B fibers, and your sort of long endurance in distance, marathon, road cycling, open water swimming, cross-country skiing, list goes on and on, up towards that type 1 end. And I should have done something. I should really have called that a type 1 as sort of an I. That's how that's done. So now you get the pleasure of me describing these fibers in intricate detail and what all their structures are. It's basically me filling out a list, so get yourselves comfy. The only thing I would add to what I've said so far are the letters that are at the top of our table here. Obviously, we've got our type 1. Let me just link these things up. The type 1 relates to that. That's our type 1 coming down here. The SO refers to slow oxidative. Okay, that's what the SO stands for. These two A's, they come down here, and we call those fog muscles, and that relates to fast oxidative glycolytic. Fast oxidative glycolytic. Okay, so that's where that fog comes from. And finally, obviously, our type 2B fibers there, these ones here at this end of the spectrum, and they're what we call fast glycolytic. They are fast glycolytic. So from the fog, we just cut out the oxidative. Okay, so let's sort of get cracking with these straight away, and let's see if we can compare and contrast and see some differences between them. Well, first of all, what is their structural size? And we're saying with the type 1 fibers that in general terms, they tend to be smaller fibers. So they tend to be small. Whereas our type 2A fibers, so I'm going to do like a salmon color, we refer to these as intermediate size, so not too big, not too small. And the FG, the type 2B fibers, we describe those ones as large. They tend to be larger, and they tend to be larger because they contain more stuff in them. They're kind of swollen because they're containing stuff. What about the color then? Well, first of all, type 1 fibers, they tend to be really red. Okay, they tend to be really red, and they tend to be red, of course, because they've got a large blood supply supplying the working muscles of marathon runners and road cyclists with lots of blood enriched with oxygen. So that's why they need to be red. The type 2A fibres, they tend to be more of like a pink colour, and the type 2B fibres, they've got very little blood supply, so those ones tend to be a kind of whiter, more kind of chicken meat kind of colour, okay? So imagine that type 1 fibres are more like kind of cow meat, beef kind of texture and colour, whereas type 2B fibres are more sort of like white, chickeny meat sort of texture, that muscle you get on a chicken. And maybe the type 2A fibres, the pink ones, then maybe you can think those of like pork type meat, maybe. I don't know how useful that is. I don't eat meat personally, so if you're also a vegetarian like me, feel free to ignore just what I just said. Okay, now then, mitochondria. Interesting point, this one. Mitochondria. First of all, what is a mitochondria? A mitochondria is a little fuel unit in muscle cells, and what it does is it produces energy in the presence of oxygen. So we're asking the question is, how many and how large are these in these fibers? Well, the type 1 slow oxidative muscle fibers, of course, they have got many mitochondria because they need to produce energy aerobically. Whereas we could say that the fog muscles, the 2As, that they do work aerobically in the presence of oxygen, but they also work anaerobically, so they've got some. Whereas our fast, powerful type 2 BFG muscles, they have got few mitochondria because they do their work anaerobically. So that kind of explains that concept. What then about glycogen stores? Glycogen can be broken down very quickly to produce anaerobic energy. So we can say then that in the type 1 fibers, we tend to find the glycogen store is low. We tend to find in the type 2As that, again, as we use this term again, they are intermediate. There is a glycogen store, but it is not that significant. But now, with regard to the type 2B fibers doing lots of anaerobic work, then of course what we've got is we've got a large or a high glycogen store. And of course that's one of the reasons maybe why that muscle is a little larger, because it's got to store this glycogen. What then about capillaries? Capillaries are the tubes, the vessels that bring a blood supply. Well, with a slow oxidative aerobic fiber, we're going to need lots, aren't we? We're going to need lots of capillaries. So we've got what we call a high capillary density, Whereas with our type 2A fast oxidative glycolytics, once again we could say this is an intermediate number and density of capillaries. Whereas we can say with our fast glycolytic fibers, they don't need a large blood supply, so we've got low density of capillaries. Okay, now then, first thing I want you to realise in terms of all that stuff I've just talked about, all of that is what we would describe as structure, okay, or structural characteristics. Look out for that word in your exam question. If the exam question asks you for a structural characteristic of a type 1 fibre, this is the stuff they're after. If, however, and I'm going to get onto this stuff now, if, however, they talk about functional characteristics, what the actual fibre does, none of the stuff I've just talked about is going to get you any marks. You need to talk about this sort of doing stuff, which I'm going to get onto now. So structural stuff at the top, functional stuff down towards the bottom. So let's make a start on that functional stuff. What is the contractile speed of slow oxidative muscle fibers? Well, of course, it's a low speed fibre. Okay, what about then our type 2As, these ones that are always in the middle? Well, once again, it's intermediate. What is the contractile speed of a fast glycolytic fibre? Well, not surprisingly, it's high speed because they're fast contracting, as we've said before, power, 100-meter javelin type muscle fibers, so they contract with high speed. We get exactly the same sort of notion with contractile force. How much contractile force for the type 1? Well, again, we've got the idea of low contractile force. With the type 2A fibers, the FOGs, we get intermediate. With the type 2B fibers, again, we get the idea of high contractile force. So we might start to think, well, these fast twitch type 2B fibers over here, they're the ones to have, right? They're obviously the best one, these fast twitch ones over here. But hang on, fatigue resistance, now we get into a different game. Do you think that type 2As are going to be fatigue resistant, bearing in mind they're used for marathon and road cycling? Well, they are, of course. They are highly fatigue resistant, Again, the 2As, intermediate, always in the middle, little bit boring. And for the type 2B fibers, they are low fatigue resistant. So in other words, they fatigue very quickly, very easily. We know that, right? If you do something really powerfully, it's common sense. It should be intuitive. If we do something very powerfully, our muscles get tired very quickly. This is why. Okay, the only thing I would add onto the end of this recording is let me just change color, is the idea of the twitch. The idea of the twitch. Sometimes you'll hear this fast twitch type 1 slow oxidative. Slow twitch type 1 slow oxidative. Fast twitch type 2A fast oxidative glycolytic. Fast twitch type 2B fast glycolytic. Well, twitch just means a single contraction. Okay, a single contraction. Okay, that's all we mean by the concept of a twitch. So don't let that kind of confuse you. It just means a single contraction. That is all from me.